Today, we're cracking open a case file that's about 2,600 years old. But I promise you, this is no dusty old document. It's more like a gripping courtroom drama. We're talking about a divine lawsuit where a sacred promise, a covenant, is literally put on trial. We are diving deep into the case of God versus his people in the second chapter of Jeremiah.
And you know, right at the heart of this whole trial is this one single, devastating question from God. It's a question just filled with this sense of confusion and hurt, and it really sets up the central mystery that we're going to unpack. Why? Why would an entire nation just walk away from a relationship that had defined its whole existence?
Okay, so before we get into the charges, we've got to set the scene, right? Every trial has a context. We need to understand the world where this all went down, because this isn't just a story. It's a snapshot of a nation teetering on the edge of disaster.
So picture this. It's 627 BC, during the reign of King Josiah. The whole world is in flux. The once unstoppable Assyrian Empire is starting to crumble, and that creates this massive power vacuum. Nations are scrambling, trying to make new, powerful friends. And spiritually, well, the situation is even worse. We're talking decades of state-sponsored idolatry from previous kings that left the nation's faith in absolute ruins. This is the chaos that Jeremiah gets called into. So get this. Jeremiah isn't just some guy shouting on a street corner. He's playing a very formal, very legal role. He is the covenant prosecutor. He's delivering what scholars call a covenant lawsuit. In this whole proceeding, God is the plaintiff, the people are the defendants, and the charge is breach of contract for breaking that sacred treaty made centuries ago at Mount Sinai.
So, how does the prosecution kick off its case? You'd think they'd come out swinging, right? With a long list of crimes. But no. They start with this surprisingly tender, almost nostalgic memory of how the relationship began.
The language here is just incredibly intimate. It's pulled straight out of a marriage covenant. God is speaking like a husband looking back on the early days of a romance, that love of espousals. He's remembering that raw, vulnerable time in the wilderness right after the Exodus, when Israel had literally nothing and had to depend on him for everything. It was a time of pure trust in a really harsh land.
And this is where the prosecution presents this absolutely jarring then versus now comparison. That early devotion, that total dependence on God, it's been swapped out for trust in worthless idols. That special holiness of being set apart for God has been replaced by a defiled land. They've basically developed a severe case of what you could call covenant amnesia. They've completely forgotten their own story.
All right, so after laying that emotional foundation, the prosecution's tone shifts. We're moving from remembering the good times to laying out the cold, hard evidence of betrayal.
So the main charge here is this covenant amnesia. And this wasn't just a simple slip of the mind. No, this was a willful cultural failure. They stopped telling the stories of how God had rescued them, how he led them through these impossible landscapes. They forgot who they were because they forgot who their God was.
And look, this forgetting wasn't a grassroots problem. It was a systemic rot that started right at the very top. Every single institution of leadership had completely failed. The priests, who were supposed to be the guides for worship, were lost themselves. The legal experts just ignore the law. The kings were only chasing power, not justice. And even the prophets, they were working for the false god Baal, all for profit and popularity.
I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The spiritual guardians of the nation, the priests inside the temple, didn't just stop asking, "Where is the Lord?" They actually invited pagan worship right into God's holy house. The corruption wasn't on the fringes, it was at the absolute heart of their spiritual identity.
And the political leadership? Just as bad. Kings like Manasseh and Amon, they didn't just tolerate idolatry, they sponsored it. They were officially promoting the worship of Baal and even engaged in the horrific practice of child sacrifice. They were literally leading the nation straight into rebellion. Now, to really drive home just how bizarre and, frankly, unnatural Judah's behavior was, the prosecution does something remarkable. It basically calls international witnesses to the stand. The court is asked to look west to Kittim, which is Cyprus, and then look east to the desert tribes of Kedar. And the point is this: even these pagan nations who worship gods that aren't even real show more loyalty to their traditions than Judah has shown to the one true living God who actually rescued them. This question just cuts right to the heart of it, and to an ancient audience, this would have been absolutely shocking. In that world, a nation just did not change its gods. It was unthinkable. It was like cultural suicide. And yet, Judah had done the unthinkable. They traded their true glory for something utterly worthless.
Okay, so all the evidence has been presented, all the testimony heard. And now the entire lawsuit builds to this final, powerful verdict. And it's all summed up in a single, unforgettable metaphor that everyone in that culture would have understood instantly.
So, after everything, the judge's verdict boils this whole complicated case down to just two specific related crimes. What are they?
Evil number 1. They walked away from the very source of life itself. A fountain of living waters is a natural spring. It's always flowing, always fresh, pure, and totally reliable. It's a picture of life that never runs out. And they abandoned it.
And evil number 2. In place of that spring, they worked their tails off to carve out their own solutions. They dug cisterns. But here's the kicker. Their cisterns, their idols, their political deals, their self-reliance, they were broken. They were man-made containers for stagnant water that just leaked out, leaving them with nothing but dust.
You really have to get this. For people living in the dry hills of Judah, this wasn't just pretty poetry. This was a brutal, everyday reality. A natural spring meant life. A broken, man-made cistern meant thirst and eventually death. The metaphor in this verdict was unmistakable. They had deliberately chosen death over life.
And so, this ancient lawsuit kind of leaves the final verdict in our hands, doesn't it? This powerful metaphor of the fountain and the cistern, it just pushes right past its historical moment and forces us to look at our own lives. It makes us ask, what are the things we build for ourselves, the things we trust in for security and for meaning, that might just be broken cisterns, destined to fail us when we need them the most?